Subscribe our channel for more videos.
800 men charged across a sandbar in the middle of the night, screaming battle cries, absolutely certain of victory. By sunrise, almost all of them were dead. Not wounded, not captured, dead. And the Americans who killed them had barely broken their defensive line. This is the story of the moment Japan's greatest warriors discovered something that shattered everything they believed about war, about themselves, and about the enemy they had completely underestimated. This is Guadalcanal, and once you understand what really happened in that jungle, you will never look at World War II the same way again. To understand why Guadalcanal broke something deep inside the Japanese military machine, you first have to understand what Japan believed going into this fight. And I mean truly believed, not just as propaganda, but as institutional gospel drilled into every soldier, every officer, every general from the moment they put on a uniform. Since 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army had been unstoppable. China fell before them. Malaya fell in a campaign so fast and so brutal that British commanders could barely process what had happened. The Philippines collapsed. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Everywhere Japanese soldiers went, they conquered. And they did it not just with numbers or equipment, but with a philosophy, a belief system about warfare that was, in their experience, simply true. Japanese military doctrine rested on a concept called seishin, spiritual power, the idea that willpower, ferocity, and the absolute rejection of death could overcome material disadvantages. That a Japanese warrior who had accepted his own death, who no longer feared anything, who attacked with total commitment and zero hesitation, was worth 10 of any Western soldier who valued his own life. This was not arrogance invented from nothing. It was a conclusion drawn from 15 years of consistent victory against Chinese forces who sometimes outnumbered them 10-1. Against British troops with better equipment, against every enemy they had faced. Spiritual power worked, night attacks worked, bayonet charges worked, close combat worked. And then they landed on Guadalcanal, and everything they knew turned out to be catastrophically, lethally wrong. The island itself looked like a dream from the air, and a nightmare the moment you stepped onto it. 90 miles long, 25 miles wide, a green jewel in the Solomon Islands chain. But that green concealed something monstrous. The interior was dominated by mountains that disappeared into permanent cloud cover, their slopes covered in jungle so dense that a man could become hopelessly lost within 50 feet of a trail. The coastal plain where the critical airfield sat was a patchwork of kunai grass sharp enough to cut skin, swamps that sucked men down to their waists, and jungle so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet even in broad daylight. The heat was not just uncomfortable, it was a physical assault. Temperatures that made thinking difficult, humidity that never dropped below 90%, that turned every piece of clothing into a sodden second skin, that made wounds fester and rot within hours. The rivers looked clear and inviting from reconnaissance photographs. They were death. Parasites invisible to the naked eye lived in every water source. The mosquitoes did not come in clouds, they came in black living curtains that men inhaled when they breathed. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, tropical ulcers, fungal infections that ate through skin down to bone. The island killed men who never fired a shot and never received a bullet. This was the arena where the Pacific War's turning point would be decided. And in August of 1942, neither side fully understood what they were walking into. The Americans arrived first. On August 7th, 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point under General Alexander Vandegrift. Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive of the entire Pacific War, had begun. The objective was straightforward on paper: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, hold until relieved. Simple, except nothing about Guadalcanal was ever going to be simple. The landing itself went remarkably well. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops stationed at the airfield took one look at 11,000 heavily armed Marines materializing out of the sea and fled into the jungle, abandoning their equipment, their food stores, their tools, and most critically, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already working on the runway. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had died in the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. Within days, the first aircraft would land. The Cactus Air Force had been born. And that airfield, that one strip of cleared coral and packed earth in the middle of a tropical nightmare, was about to become the most strategically important piece of real estate in the entire Pacific. Here is what made Henderson Field so fundamentally decisive and why both sides would pour so much blood into the fight for it. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the surrounding seas for roughly 200 miles in every direction during daylight hours. American aircraft operating from Henderson Field could hunt and sink any Japanese ship foolish enough to appear in those waters while the sun was up. This meant Japan could only resupply and reinforce Guadalcanal at night, using fast destroyers in runs that Americans would eventually nickname the Tokyo Express. But when dawn broke, America aircraft ruled. The dark belonged to Japan, America belonged to the day. And that split reality would dictate the entire hideous logic of the campaign for the next 6 months. But before any of that strategic reality could fully develop, Japan made a decision that would define the first chapter of the battle, and it was a decision driven not by tactical assessment, but something far dangerous: contempt. The Imperial Japanese response to the American landing was swift, but it was also deeply, fatally condescending. Imperial General Headquarters dispatched Colonel Kianao Ichiki and his detachment to Guadalcanal. Ichiki was no fool. He was an infantry school instructor with a reputation as a first-rate tactical thinker. He was also a man who had absorbed 15 years of Japanese military triumphalism so completely that it replaced his ability to reason objectively about the enemy in front of him. Before departing for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit orders: wait for the full regiment before attacking. Do not move prematurely. Assess the situation before committing forces. These were not suggestions, they were direct orders from his superiors, based on a rational understanding that launching 900 men against an unknown American force of potentially much larger size was reckless. Ichiki ignored them, because he had studied the Americans. He had read the reports from the Philippines, from Bataan, from everywhere Western forces had encountered Japanese troops. They broke. They panicked. They surrendered in droves. They were soft men from comfortable lives who had never truly accepted death the way Japanese warriors had. These Marines on Guadalcanal, they might number 2,000, perhaps 3. It did not matter. They had not been tested in real war. One night attack by hardened veterans of China and Southeast Asia would sweep them into the sea before sunrise. On the night of August 18th, 6 Japanese destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first element to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing was silent, smooth, completely undetected. Ichiki sent out reconnaissance patrols and began moving west toward the airfield. Then, on August 19th, Captain Charles Brush of the 1st Marines was leading a patrol along the coastal track when his men collided with one of Ichiki's patrols in a brief, savage firefight. The Americans killed 31 Japanese soldiers, but more importantly, they captured documents, papers that revealed the presence of a significant enemy force. Papers that showed, shockingly, how badly Japan had underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with this intelligence gold. General Vandegrift understood immediately. A large Japanese force was east of the perimeter. They were coming soon, and based on the captured documents, they were coming with absolute confidence that they would roll over whatever stood in their way.
Vandegrift ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defenses along the Ilu River, which Marines were calling the Tanaru due to a map error that would stick in historical accounts forever. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, moved into position along the riverbank. Machine guns were sighted with methodical precision to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar at the river's mouth. Every machine gun covered the field of fire of every other machine gun. Anywhere a Japanese soldier might stand on that sandbar, at least 2 guns would have him in their sights simultaneously. Mortars were registered on likely approach routes. Artillery from supporting units was plotted and ready. The Marines dug in, camouflaged their positions, and waited in absolute silence. Ichiki chose not to wait for his lost patrol to return. He chose not to wait for additional intelligence. He chose not to wait for his full regiment. Colonel Ichiki, with the certainty of a man who had never seriously doubted himself, ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar in the darkness of August 20th going into the early morning of August 21st. Japanese doctrine was clear on this. Night attacks were the great equalizer. American firepower was dangerous in daylight, but could be neutralized by darkness and speed. Scream loud, move fast, close the distance before they can react. Get in among them with bayonets, where Japanese soldiers excelled and American soldiers crumbled. This formula had worked in China. It had worked in Malaya. It would work here. Just after midnight, something extraordinary happened that would add one of the most remarkable human stories to the entire battle. Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, a former native constabulary sergeant who had been captured by Japanese forces days earlier and tortured for hours, who had been left for dead with multiple bayonet wounds to his chest and throat, refused to die. He refused to give up the Americans. He refused to give information. And when his captors left him, he crawled through the jungle, through the darkness, for miles. With bamboo stakes driven into his body and wounds that should have killed him, he crawled until he reached Marine lines and gasped out a warning. The Japanese are coming right now. They are coming right now. Minutes later, Ichiki's men burst out of the darkness. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming, rifles up, grenades ready, absolute commitment to the attack pouring from every man. They were veterans. They were trained to a razor's edge. They were brave beyond any reasonable question. They ran directly into hell. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire simultaneously. These weapons were masterpieces of sustained killing. 600 rounds per minute, every minute, for as long as the water jacket stayed filled and the ammunition held out. The Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting arcs so that every inch of the sandbar was covered. Japanese soldiers fell in waves. The .30 caliber rounds did not wound men. At those ranges, with that concentration of fire, they destroyed them. Those who somehow made it across the sandbar ran into 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells, each one containing dozens of steel balls that spread out in a cone of destruction that no human body could survive. Wave after wave came. This is the part that has to be understood clearly to grasp the psychological magnitude of what happened. The Japanese did not run after the first charge failed. They did not pull back and reassess. They attacked again and again and again for hours throughout the entire night. Some reached the Marine positions and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, brutal and savage, fought with rifles and knives and fists and entrenching tools. The Marines held. The interlocking fields of fire that Vandegrift's men had so carefully prepared were doing exactly what they were designed to do. No breakthrough came. No panic spread through American lines. The Marines waited in their positions, fired in their designated sectors, and systematically killed everyone who came at them. As dawn approached, Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his 917 men lay dead or dying on that sandbar and in the shallow water. The numbers are almost incomprehensible until you stand there in your mind and try to imagine what that looked like. 800 men, 800 human beings, killed in a single night on a sandbar a few hundred meters long. And then the sun came up, and the Americans counterattacked. General Vandegrift sent elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, across the sandbar to pursue the survivors. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed over and began hunting Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched from a Marine position and described the tanks moving among the trees, pivoting, turning, pouring fire into every hiding place, flushing out men who survived the night only to die in the morning light. By midday on August 21st, it was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Colonel Ichiki himself died that morning, though exactly how remains disputed. The official Japanese account claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Other witnesses insisted he died leading one final charge into the guns. Either way, the man who dismissed warnings, ignored orders to wait for reinforcements, and led his men in a frontal assault based on contempt for his enemy was dead alongside nearly everything he commanded. Marine casualties were approximately 40 killed and wounded, 40 against 800. The surviving Japanese soldiers who melted into the jungle and radioed news of the disaster to 17th Army headquarters sent a message that should have fundamentally restructured Japanese military thinking about the campaign ahead. It did not, could not, because the cultural and institutional machinery of the Imperial Japanese Army was not built for that kind of honest reckoning.
What those survivors described in their messages and diaries was something that contradicted everything they had been taught. The Americans had not panicked under night attack. They had not broken when screaming warriors charged them with bayonets. They had not run when the first casualties fell. Instead, they had waited quietly in prepared positions, allowed Japanese forces to enter killing zones, and then destroyed them with coordinated firepower of a volume and precision that Japanese doctrine had never accounted for. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed capacity. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and fire support represented an integrated system of destruction that these veterans had never encountered in China, in Southeast Asia, anywhere. But Imperial General Headquarters had already set the next operation in motion before the full magnitude of the Tanaru disaster was even understood. Because Henderson Field still existed, American aircraft were still flying from it. And that meant the airfield had to be taken, regardless of the cost. The Tokyo Express began running. Between August 29th and September 4th, destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Guadalcanal. The destroyers were fast enough to make the round trip from the Shortland Islands in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attack. The system worked brilliantly as a method of moving men, but it had a fatal flaw that would haunt every Japanese soldier on the island for the remainder of the campaign. Heavy equipment could not travel on destroyer decks. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, food in adequate quantities, medical supplies in adequate quantities, ammunition in adequate quantities. All of it had to be left behind or drastically reduced. Soldiers arrived carrying what they could personally haul through jungle terrain. They came ashore dependent on whatever they could forage from an island that was not theirs, supplemented by whatever trickle of supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. This was not a temporary problem to be solved later.
This was the foundational logistical reality of the entire Japanese campaign on Guadalcanal, and it was a sentence of slow death that the men of the Tokyo Express were being handed the moment their boots hit the sand. General Kawaguchi's plan for the second major assault on Henderson Field was more sophisticated than Ichiki's blunt charge. He was a more cautious and thoughtful commander, and to his credit, he understood that simply running at American machine guns in the darkness was not a viable strategy. His plan called for 3 coordinated prongs of attack. One force would strike from the west along the coast. A second would attack from the south through dense jungle. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, approaching along a narrow coral ridge that dominated Henderson Field from that direction. Intelligence suggested this ridge was the weakest point in American defenses. Intelligence was wrong. Marine intelligence had already identified the ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, was one of the most aggressive and tactically gifted officers in the Marine Corps. He conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive Japanese supply dumps that could only mean one thing: a large force was concentrating in the area. Edson studied the terrain, studied the approach routes, and understood exactly what Kawaguchi was planning. The ridge was the avenue of approach. The ridge needed to be defended. Edson requested permission to put his raiders on the high ground. Vandegrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge with the same meticulous attention to fire discipline and mutual support that had characterized the Tanaru defenses. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire, mortar crews registering on likely approach routes, artillery from the 11th Marines plotting defensive fire missions with precise coordinates for every likely avenue of Japanese advance. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine about 1,000 meters long, covered with kunai grass and scattered trees, with deep jungle-choked ravines on both sides, perfect terrain for infiltrating infantry, also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. This was different from Ichiki's blunt instrument. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both flanks, attempting to envelop American positions and find weak points before concentrating for breakthroughs. Small units probed and tested the line. When they found a soft spot, larger forces poured toward it. The fighting became savage and profoundly confused in the darkness. Marines found themselves in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had crept to within grenade range through the undergrowth. The noise was indescribable: screaming, explosions, machine gun fire cutting through the black air, the sound of men dying in ways that no training truly prepares you for. But the defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery responded with terrifying precision. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night alone, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red-hot in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, and trenching tools, bare hands. And then was Sergeant John Basilone. This is the name that history remembers from Bloody Ridge, and the reality of what he did that night belongs in the same conversation as any act of individual heroism in the entire Second World War. Basilone manned a machine gun position that became absolutely critical to the defense when the Japanese assault reached its most intense point. When his gun crews were killed or wounded around him, Basilone did not leave. He continued firing alone, depressing his gun to ground level to cut down attackers who were within feet of his position. When ammunition blew low, he moved through enemy fire to bring more rounds forward. When a gun malfunctioned, he repaired it under fire, under darkness, with men dying around him and Japanese soldiers close enough that he could hear their individual voices. He held his section of the line. He would receive the Medal of Honor for what he did that night. He absolutely earned it. Jacob Vuza, the same native scout who had crawled through the jungle with bayonet wounds to warn of the Tanaru attack, moved through the lines again during the Battle of Bloody Ridge, guiding Marines, pointing out infiltration routes, serving as a link between American forces and the jungle knowledge that only someone who had grown up on these islands could possess. The man simply refused to be stopped. Dawn on September 13th brought the discovery that Kawaguchi's assault had failed to break through. But he had more troops available. He was preparing to renew the assault. Edson pulled his lines back to a consolidated position on the center of the ridge, creating stronger mutual support between his remaining units. Vandegrift brought reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men.
The second night was worse than the first. Kawaguchi threw everything he had left into desperate attempts to break through before the American position became completely impregnable. Waves of Japanese soldiers died in the machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. The situation at certain moments was so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle, moved to the firing line, and began shooting alongside his men. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Approximately 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around Edson's Ridge over those 2 nights. Marine casualties were roughly 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the 2 battalions engaged. The ridge that Marines named Bloody Ridge, that history records as Edson's Ridge, had proven something that the Battle of the Tanaru had suggested and that every subsequent engagement on Guadalcanal would confirm. American defensive doctrine, properly executed, with coordinated fire support and methodically prepared positions, was destroying Japanese forces at ratios that Japan simply could not sustain. For Japanese survivors of Bloody Ridge, the psychological impact went deeper than the shock of Ichiki's men. Because this time, Japan had tried something more sophisticated. Not just a frontal charge, but infiltration tactics, flanking movements, multiple coordinated attacks, and it had still failed. Captured diaries from Japanese soldiers who died on that ridge revealed the same theme over and over. They had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their training and spirit would triumph. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all coordinated with a precision they could not match, responding to their movements with a speed and lethality that suggested the Americans somehow knew where they were going before they got there. Between the battles, the island itself continued its patient work of killing everyone on it without distinction. Malaria struck nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks in the jungle. The 1st Marine Division would eventually report over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was universal. Fungal infections ate through skin. The men grew thin and hollow-eyed, their uniforms rotting off their bodies in the constant wet heat. But American supply ships, protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours, kept arriving. Food came, ammunition came, medicine came, quinine tablets for malaria prevention came, blood plasma for transfusions came, replacement equipment came. The shortages were real, particularly in those desperate weeks of August and early September, when naval defeats had temporarily cut the Marines off. But they were temporary. The supply system was imperfect and stressed, but it functioned. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal had no such system. They had the Tokyo Express, which was brilliant at moving men, but nearly useless for moving the volume of supplies that a sustained military campaign required. From the moment Japanese troops stepped off those destroyer decks, they were already running a deficit against basic human survival requirements. Rations were inadequate from day one. Medical supplies that were critical ran out quickly and were never adequately resupplied. Quinine for malaria prevention essentially ceased to exist as a practical matter within weeks. Wounded soldiers faced a stark arithmetic.
If your wound was serious, you were likely going to die from infection because there was nothing to treat it with. Soldiers who could not walk were sometimes given grenades when their units moved. A grenade was the only medical care that could be offered. Men began eating grass, bark from trees, whatever could be found in the jungle that would not kill them outright, though some soldiers died from eating poisonous plants they could not identify in their desperation. A single rice ball stretched to cover an entire day's nutrition for a grown man doing physical labor in extreme heat. The sick and the starving filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors watched patients die, knowing exactly what treatment would save them and having none of it. A medical officer's report captured later in the campaign noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Men were dying at 50 per day, most of them from starvation and disease rather than American bullets. The contrast was not subtle. It was not a marginal difference in supply capacity. It was the difference between an army that could fight and an army that was slowly being murdered by its own strategic circumstances. And this disparity, perhaps more than any single battle, was what genuinely terrified Japanese soldiers who were coherent enough to process what was happening to them. Not the Americans individually, though American soldiers proved formidable beyond all prediction, but the realization that the American machine did not break, that American logistics created a floor beneath which American combat power could not fall below a certain level, while Japanese logistics created a ceiling above which Japanese combat power could not rise. In late October, Japan made its largest and most desperate attempt to change this equation. General Hikatake himself came to Guadalcanal, bringing elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops who had fought in China. This was no improvised assault by an impatient colonel. This was a carefully planned, multi-directional offensive with more men, better coordination, and artillery support that had finally been physically transported to the island at enormous cost. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort again coming from the south, the same general approach that Kawaguchi had attempted at Bloody Ridge, but this time with far greater numbers and firepower. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west, led by something rare on Guadalcanal because of the sheer difficulty of transporting them. 9 Japanese tanks crossed toward the Matinaku River. American defenders, now including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Americal Division, were waiting with anti-tank guns, artillery, and even American M3 Stuart tanks. All 9 Japanese tanks were destroyed in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties before the main effort had even begun. The main assault came on the night of October 24th into 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu struck from the south, attempting to finally break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller, a man whose nickname Chesty was as much a descriptor of his aggressive spirit as it was anything physical, reinforced by elements of the 164th. The fighting that night became the stuff of Marine Corps legend. Wave after wave of Japanese attacks came throughout the entire night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate counterattacks, sometimes by handfuls of men closing a gap with rifles and bayonets in the darkness. Machine gunners fired until their weapons literally failed from heat and use, then grabbed rifles and kept shooting. The 11th Marines fired danger-close artillery missions that landed within yards of Marine positions. The battleship USS Washington sat offshore, ready to add 16-inch shells to the equation if called upon.
And Basilone was there again. At a critical moment when ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, he personally carried ammunition through enemy fire to keep his guns operational. He repaired damaged weapons under direct fire. When a gun position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the line. One man, one section of the line, held. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed for the third time. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night charges. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers had died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe and real, but replaceable in a way that Japanese losses simply were not. November brought the naval battles that settled the strategic question permanently. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 brutal nights from November 12th through 15th, saw some of the most intense surface combat in the entire history of naval warfare. American cruisers and destroyers clashed in the darkness with Japanese battleships in a confused, point-blank melee where ships were sometimes so close that gunners were firing directly at the muzzle flashes of the enemy. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in surface naval engagements during the entire Second World War, died in the fighting on the night of November 13th. America lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. The cost was enormous. But the Japanese battleship He was disabled in the night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. The bombardment mission against Henderson Field had failed. The airfield remained operational. The following night, the battleship Kirishima attempted what He had not accomplished and ran directly into the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating demonstration of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank, and then American aircraft and surface ships found the Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with the heavy equipment that should have been coming to Guadalcanal for months. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 actually reached the island, and those 4 were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy alone exceeded 5,000 men. That was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November was the moment when the last ember of hope died. They had been waiting for reinforcement. They had been told help was coming. When news filtered down through the destroyed command structure that the convoys had been smashed, that the naval battles had failed, that no more significant help was coming, something broke in the collective psychology of the Japanese force on the island. Rations were cut again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. The sick and the wounded died in increasing numbers in field hospitals where doctors had nothing left to offer them. Captured Japanese diaries from this period are among the most haunting documents in the entire historical record of the Pacific War. Entries that began in August with confidence and martial pride turned through October into confusion and exhaustion, and by November and December into something close to pure despair. Rice reduced to 1 ball per day, disease spreading through every unit, bodies burned when soldiers had the strength to burn them, left where they fell when they did not, men eating grass and bark, men dying from poisonous plants, men so weakened by starvation that they could no longer lift their rifles. The realization, written in shaking handwriting by men who knew they were probably writing their last words, that no more supplies were coming, that they had been sent here to die. And through all of it, Henderson Field kept flying. American aircraft kept ruling the daylight sky. American supply ships kept arriving with food and medicine and ammunition. American engineers kept repairing bomb damage and extending the runway and improving the facilities. The machine kept working. The machine would not stop.
December brought the final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision that could not be spoken aloud. They would evacuate Guadalcanal. The official framing called it a strategic repositioning, a voluntary withdrawal to more defensible positions. Everyone who used those words knew they were lying. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese personnel who had served on the island across the entire campaign, roughly 11,000 remained. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were capable of walking under their own power. The rest were so sick, so starved, so broken that they could barely crawl. What happened next was genuinely remarkable. Operation K, the Japanese evacuation, executed across 3 nights in early February 1943, using destroyer runs almost identical to the Tokyo Express that had delivered men to their deaths, extracted 10,652 Japanese soldiers from Guadalcanal. Conducted under constant threat of American air and naval attack, moving at night with extraordinary discipline and seamless naval execution, it was one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war, and it could not disguise by even a sliver the magnitude of what it was: a retreat, a defeat, a catastrophe. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of those, roughly 25 to 30,000 died. Approximately 14,800 killed in combat, 10,000 to 15,000 killed by disease, starvation, and the 1,000 variations of slow death that the island and Japanese logistics inflicted on men who should never have been sent there without adequate supply. American casualties were also severe. The Marines and Army units who fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical disease. But American industry and manpower could replace every one of those losses, and then some. New divisions were already training. Ships were being produced faster than battles could sink them. Aircraft factories were working around the clock. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. On February 9, 1943, American patrols moving through the jungle discovered that the Japanese had vanished. General Patch sent the message to Admiral Halsey: Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. 6 months of fighting, the first major American ground victory against Japan in the Pacific War, and more than a victory, a revelation. The lessons Japanese survivors carried from Guadalcanal shattered pre-war military doctrine in ways that the official institutional framework of the Imperial Japanese Army could not honestly acknowledge. Officers who survived the campaign and were later interviewed, or who wrote post-war accounts, were remarkably consistent in what they described. They completely and catastrophically underestimated American fighting quality. Not just American equipment, though the material disparity was far greater than intelligence had suggested, but American tactical competence, American defensive skill, American endurance under terrible conditions, and the quality of American leadership at every level, from general down to sergeant. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions, which directly contradicted the entire Japanese theory that night belonged to the attacker. They admitted that Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and conditions as brutal as anything Japanese soldiers faced, while maintaining combat effectiveness because logistics supported them. They recognized that American firepower was not just greater in quantity, but coordinated in ways that multiplied its effectiveness exponentially. A single American battalion could deliver more effective fire than an entire Japanese regiment. That was not exaggeration, that was the documented reality of engagement after engagement on that island.
The technical picture told a stark story. Japanese soldiers fought with Arisaka bolt-action rifles, requiring manual cycling between shots.
American Marines carried M1903 Springfields, supplemented by increasing numbers of M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles, whose 8-round capacity and rate of fire provided decisive advantages in firefights. American machine guns, the water-cooled Browning heavy guns, could sustain fire indefinitely, limited only by water and ammunition supply, both of which American logistics provided in quantities that Japanese soldiers would have considered almost mythological. Japanese machine guns were lighter and more portable, optimized for the mobile offensive warfare that was Japan's preferred fighting style, but fundamentally inferior in sustained defensive firepower, which was exactly the kind of fighting that Guadalcanal demanded. American artillery support was perhaps the single most decisive technical factor. The 11th Marines could receive a fire request from a forward observer with infantry units and put rounds on target within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to move through jungle terrain, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added a dimension beyond anything Japanese forces could match, with destroyers and cruisers offshore able to deliver precision bombardments on Japanese positions when called. And the Cactus Air Force, operating under appalling conditions, with aircraft that were patched and repatched, with pilots flying multiple missions per day until some of them were so exhausted they could barely walk to their planes, gradually established air superiority that made every Japanese movement during daylight a potential death sentence. The Japanese officers who were thoughtful enough to look honestly at what Guadalcanal meant understood they were looking at something existential. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited the island during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely and fundamentally reassess its strategic situation. The Americans were fighting an industrial war, he wrote, where material production determined outcomes. Japan could not win an industrial war against American productive capacity. The math was simply and absolutely not in Japan's favor. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent years of unbroken triumph, could not accept this diagnosis honestly enough to act on it in time. The official explanations for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, unexpected naval defeats, and the unforeseen strength of American defenses. These explanations were all true as far as they went, but they stopped short of the deeper truth that tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire philosophy of warfare that had served Japan brilliantly against China, against European colonial forces, against every opponent it had faced since 1937, was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent that combined fighting spirit with logistics, firepower with tactical skill, and courage with systems that never stopped working. For the Japanese soldiers who survived the island and were evacuated during Operation K, Guadalcanal did not end when they stepped off the destroyers. They carried it with them. In their bodies, ravaged by disease and starvation that some of them would never fully recover from. In their minds, where the experience of seeing everything they had been taught about their own invincibility proven catastrophically wrong had created a kind of quiet, permanent dread. Many of them would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate in exactly the direction that Colonel Tsuji had privately recognized. Some of them survived the entire war and lived to be interviewed, to write memoirs, to sit in the silence of old age and describe what Guadalcanal had meant. What they described consistently across decades of post-war testimony was a moment of transformation. They had entered the campaign as warriors of an invincible empire, absolutely certain of their superiority. They left as starving survivors of a catastrophic defeat who understood in their bones, and not just their minds, that Japan was going to lose the war. Not might lose, was going to lose. The Americans were not weak, they were overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons, but in organization, in logistics, in the ability to sustain operations, in the institutional capacity to learn from mistakes and adapt. And nothing Japan possessed in the realm of courage and sacrifice could overcome an enemy whose supplies did not run out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never went silent, whose aircraft controlled the sky, and whose industrial base was replacing losses faster than any battle could inflict them. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal carried different lessons. That American forces could match Japanese troops in the raw brutality of jungle combat and come out the other side still fighting. That the mythology of Japanese invincibility was exactly that, a myth, built on legitimate tactical skill, but also on a fundamental misreading of what war against a modern industrial opponent actually looked like. That American defensive doctrine, properly executed, was capable of destroying Japanese offensive power at ratios that were almost impossible to believe until you counted the bodies. That combined arms coordination, the ability to integrate infantry, artillery, air power, and naval gunfire into a single coherent system of destruction, created military effectiveness that no amount of individual courage could overcome. These lessons became the foundation of American Pacific strategy for the rest of the war.
General Vandegrift's Marines, when they were finally pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, were hollow-eyed scarecrows, gray with disease and exhaustion, but they had done something that no Allied ground force had yet done in the Pacific War. They had fought Japanese forces in sustained ground combat, on terrain that favored Japanese tactics, in conditions that stripped every advantage except pure will and training, and they had won. Not marginally, decisively, repeatedly. They had taken every offensive Japan could mount, absorbed every night attack, every infiltration, every coordinated assault, and answered each one with firepower and discipline that turned Japanese tactical doctrine into a death sentence for the men who followed it. The island of Guadalcanal bore the physical scars of those 6 months for decades. Wrecked aircraft rusting in the jungle, destroyed vehicles half swallowed by undergrowth, unexploded ordnance that continued killing people long after the last soldier left. The bones of men on both sides who died in places so remote that no one ever found them. Henderson Field expanded into a major Allied base that supported subsequent operations up the Solomon Islands chain. Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of water between Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands, received its name from the ships of both nations that now lay on its floor, their crews still aboard. 7,000 American and Allied sailors died in the naval battles around the island. More than 7,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing in the ground fighting. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases that damaged their health permanently. The cost was staggering. Whether it was worth it is the question that every serious historian of the Pacific War eventually has to face. The military answer is yes. Without Henderson Field and the forces that held it, Allied operations in the Pacific could not have progressed as they did. Guadalcanal forced Japan to commit and then destroy experienced troops, skilled pilots, veteran sailors, and naval assets that could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate America was producing new ones. The Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers during the Guadalcanal campaign. Hundreds of trained, experienced pilots died in the air battles over the island. These were losses Japan could not absorb in a long war against the world's largest industrial economy. The strategic implications extended to every corner of the Pacific. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field demonstrated that the outer defensive perimeter of the Japanese Empire could be penetrated and held. Allied strategy shifted from desperate defense to the long, grinding, island-by-island offensive that would eventually bring the war to Japan's home islands. Every campaign that followed, from New Georgia to Bougainville to New Guinea to the Philippines to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, was built on the template that Guadalcanal established.
The lessons learned in blood and jungle fever and starvation on that island became the operational doctrine of the Allied Pacific War. Guadalcanal was not where Japan was defeated. The war had 2 more years to run, and millions more people would die before it ended. But Guadalcanal was where the outcome became, for those willing to read it honestly, inevitable. It was where the myth of Japanese warrior superiority finally collided with the reality of American industrial and organizational power, and shattered on that contact the way Ichiki's 800 men shattered on the Ilu River sandbar. It was where Japanese troops discovered that the terror was not in facing American soldiers as individual fighters, though those soldiers proved formidable beyond all expectation. The terror was in discovering that the American system did not have an off switch, that you could fight all night and kill 100 of them, and in the morning there would be more, and more food, and more ammunition, and more aircraft, and more ships, that you could sacrifice everything Japan asked you to sacrifice, every comfort, every safety, your health, your future, ultimately your life, and it would not be enough. Because you were not fighting men, you were fighting a machine that happened to be operated by men, and the machine did not get tired, did not get sick, did not run out of ammunition, and did not stop. That was the terror of Guadalcanal, and that terror was justified, because the machine did not stop. It never stopped again. If this story reached something in you that you did not expect, that is what the best history does. It reminds us that the people who lived through these moments were real, that the fear and courage and sacrifice were real, that the consequences were real and vast and still shape the world we live in. Drop a comment below about the moment in this story that hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs to understand what the Pacific War really looked like at its turning point. And if you want to go deeper into the stories that changed the world, but that most people never hear told this way, subscribe, because we are just getting started.